On this Saturday afternoon, 60 years ago, firefighters were wading through the debris of 20 buildings, spraying the smoldering remains and digging through the ruins to extinguish elusive flames and pop-up fires. 24 hours earlier, they had been fighting for their lives and to save Lebanon's commercial district. Few moments can so clearly divide Lebanon's history into before and after. There was before the fire, and there was after the fire. And in the middle were hours of immense danger, destruction, bravery, tragedy, and determination. Today, we'll be revisiting the history of that day, the fire's path of destruction, and some of the experiences of some of the people who were there that day. And at the end, we'll have time for some questions, and I hope that those of you who are here will maybe share some anecdotes and memories that you had from that day. Some of you know the stories and the experiences from friends or family. Some of you were there and have your own stories. Some of you may know little more than that the fire occurred. I hope that today's talk will provide new insights, a deeper understanding of the events of June 19, 1964, and perhaps a fact or anecdote that you've never heard before. The fire began around 4 p.m. on June 19th, but the events that led to the fire began far earlier. Hanover Street dates back to the earliest part of the 19th century. It connected Colburn Park, originally home to Lebanon's Meeting House, located in the middle of the town common, with Hanover to the north. And Hanover Street would quickly grow to become the Center Village's predominant commercial district. This 1853 map shows the stretch from Colburn Park up to Huff Square. At this time it was known as Bridge Street. This section was home to the Granite State Whig, Lebanon's local newspaper, McPhee's Harness Shop, the Kimball and Fales Country Store, the post office, and other important businesses and institutions. Mill Street, running north from Mascoma Street on Benton Hill to Hanover Street, which you can see running here up to Huff Square, was a similarly central industrial hub. By the 1880s, as seen in this map, it was dominated by grist mills, machine shops, and woodworking factories. The area was devastated the first time in 1887, when a fire ignited in the Mead Mason & Company shop on Water Street and leveled 80 buildings across 12 acres, including nearly all of Mill Street and the south side of Hanover Street. This image, taken from High Street across the river, shows the destroyed Mill Street, right along the river, and Hanover Street with the bridge over the railroad, and that's the Whipple Block. This devastating catastrophe served as little more than a temporary roadblock, however, and both streets quickly returned to their previous prominence. As this photo from only 2 years later demonstrates, it's taken from the tower of Lebanon's town hall. It shows the Whipple Block and Hanover Street stretching up to Huff Square, and we can just see Mill Street winding through here with the buildings being rebuilt, including the old grist mill and the LeMay or Howard Block. Remember that one, because that one's going to come back. Though the area quickly recovered after the fire, Lebanon's businesses and residents were forced to rebuild, not with brick, but with wood. Hanover had experienced its own catastrophic fire earlier that same year, and the Densmore Brick Company didn't have enough bricks to rebuild Lebanon as well. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Hanover Street and Mill Street only more firmly established themselves as the center of Lebanon's commercial industrial enterprise. Mill Street was home to the Granite State Free Press, feed and supply shops, warehouses, and on the corner of Mill Street and Hanover Street, Lander's Restaurant. Hanover Street featured McNeil's Drugstore, Woolworths, Hildreth's, Pulsipher's, Jetty's Shoe Repair, Courier's Department Store, the fire station, and many other offices and stores. The early 20th century was hardly clear sailing for the area, though. Fires in the Whipple Block twice, in Hildreth's, you can see at the top left, in Woolworth's here in 1945, and other buildings steadily renovated Hanover Street, while similar fires threatened Mill Street. By 1964, however, the district's last serious fire was nearly 20 years in the past, but other threats had grown up. The decline of textile manufacturing led to the slow but steady closure of Lebanon's woolen mills, and the rise of automobiles led to the end of the rail era, with only 2 trains per day serving Lebanon in 1961. Regular passenger rail service would end entirely in 1965. Following the closure of the mills, commerce in town was similarly depressed. Hunt's department store closed at the end of 1961, the Lebanon drugstore closed in early 1964, and the Endicott Johnson shoe store was scheduled to close at the end of June in 1964. All were located in the heart of Hanover Street. Developers began looking toward the 12A corridor at what would be the exit 820 interchange on the coming interstate. But it would still be several years before the area formerly known as Gutmanville would emerge as Lebanon's new commercial hub. In the meantime, Lebanon's residents were as likely to travel to Claremont to do their shopping as patronize local shops. Despite these challenges, however, there was no shortage of shops, offices, restaurants, and residences on Hanover Street and Mill Street. Sherwin-Williams Paint, The News Spot, Hildreth's Hardware, Woolworths, the Lamplighter Restaurant, Tom's Toggery, and Richard Kudemanch's barber shop anchored the northeast end of Hanover Street. On the opposite side of the street were Courier's, Western Auto, McNeil's Pharmacy, Courier's Custom Shop, and Fletcher's Paint Shop, with the thrift store directly behind in the Guile block. Across the drawbridge were Lewis Brothers Hardware, Suburban Gas, and Hirsch's Army and Navy store on the north side, with Hooker's Eagle Garage behind the block on Taylor Street. The Howard block on the south corner of Mill Street contained Creighton's Taxi Company, Brown's Bicycle Shop, Modern Record Shop, Laura's Beauty Shop, and the Valley Yarn Shop. Across Mill Street stood Langer's Restaurant. On the other side of the river, in House Square, were the Singer Store, the White Owl Diner, and the mobile service station. While Hanover Street served as the Lebanon Village's main street, by 1964 Mill Street was less commercial destination and more afterthought. Past Landers on the right stood the Jordan apartment block, the Lebanon Launder Center, and the old grist mill. Beyond Brown's bike shop on the left stood the aging Granite State Free Press building with apartments upstairs and a pool hall downstairs. Across the level rail crossing on the left stood an old storage building and an abandoned blacksmith shop, which is where the fire began. Albert Healy was 21, and his companion, Joe Thibodeau, was 16 when they wandered Hanover Street and Mill Street on the afternoon of Friday, June 19, 1964, looking for something to do. That something ended up being some petty crime. They went into 13 Mill Street, the abandoned blacksmith shop, known to shelter impoverished and often intoxicated people, and found an old rug that looked like it would burn. Albert rolled the rug up and leaned it against a wall before lighting it. Then he and Joe retreated to watch what they thought would be a few fleeing vagrants and a little excitement for the fire department. What actually happened destroyed 20 buildings, ruined or displaced 22 businesses, caused approximately $3 million in damage, or $30 million in today's dollars, rendered 100 people homeless, and left 2 people dead. The inflamed rug quickly set fire to the nearly 70-year-old blacksmith shop. On a normal day, it would likely have spread to the neighboring storage shed and been duly extinguished by the firefighters stationed at the top of Benton Hill, only 500 feet away. June 19th wasn't an ordinary day, however. At 4 p.m., it was 85 degrees, and the wind was blowing at an average 14 miles per hour from the south, a wind that would fan the flames and blow the fire well past the storage shed into the tightly packed old buildings beyond. At 4:08 that afternoon, 15-year-old Charles Blair spotted the fire rapidly enveloping the blacksmith shop and ran to the fire station to report the fire. At the same time, someone pulled a call box, and Shirley Creighton, working in the Howard block a few doors down, phoned in the report. and actually working at Western Auto on Hanover Street, stepped out the shop's back door just in time to see the flames shoot up above the smoke. By 4:15, 7 minutes after the first report, the fire department had already summoned assistance from Hanover and Hartford. By the time the day was done, more than 150 firefighters, and perhaps as many as 300, would be involved from 17 towns, some as far away as Claremont, Sunapee, Woodstock, and Fairleigh. An untold number of volunteers to assist them. Lebanon firefighter Charles Brown was in the first truck to arrive on the scene. He and his colleagues immediately directed their fire hoses at the flames, but quickly realized two things: that the water wasn't having any effect, and that the fire itself was almost too hot to fight. Half a century later, Brown recalled that the hose nozzles themselves were too hot to hold. As the fire quickly spread, first to the neighboring storage shed and then to the hickory block beyond, the firefighters hurried to evacuate the fire truck from the street before it was consumed. Roland Thibodeau took his axe to the hoses stretching down the road, destroying and abandoning the equipment in the rush to save the truck. Later, firefighters estimate that 1,000 feet of fire hose was lost fighting the fire. At 4:20, another team of firefighters parked on Hanover Street and dragged the hose down Mill Street to attack the fire in the hickory block, which is a structure we can see inflamed here. The fire started just on the other side of this building. And here's the hickory block in better times. They quickly realized that the fire had torn through the building so rapidly that at least one man was trapped on the third floor of the hickory block. Minutes later, firefighter Gabby Heron ascended a ladder to the third story to rescue 67-year-old George LeMay, trapped in his apartment as the flames engulfed the building. Heron suffered second-degree burns as he dragged LeMay, his clothes on fire, out the window. LeMay was quickly rushed to the hospital, with Heron by his side the whole way. Both men were treated for their burns. Heron recovered, but LeMay, with burns over 85% of his body, died the next morning. George LeMay, unfortunately, wasn't the only fatality. One of his neighbors in the hickory block, who was purportedly with LeMay at the time of the fire, was 70-year-old Henry LeBlanc, a native of Quebec who had been a resident of Lebanon for several years. LeBlanc's body would be found in the charred rubble the following morning, burnt beyond recognition. As the fire consumed the eastern side of Mill Street, it destroyed telephone poles, releasing the live power lines into the street and hindering the firefighting. Power to the eastern half of Lebanon went out, including to the pumping station, which kept the fire hydrants supplied with water. Firefighters rightly feared that their water supply would give out. Fortunately, Lebanon's reservoir contained sufficient water to continue battling the blaze until power was restored at the pumping station. The engulfed hickory block quickly ignited the neighboring Howard block, highlighted here. The large building was home to multiple businesses and apartments, and like the rest of the neighborhood, dated back to the 19th century. While the growing conflagration had so far been confined to Mill Street, it spread to the Howard block, brought the fire onto Hanover Street. So this is a view looking down Hanover Street with the Howard block on fire. And then from the opposite end, on the bridge over the river, the Howard block being consumed. Across Hanover Street from the Howard block stood Lewis Brothers Hardware. And clerk Bruce Johnson and Jack Tabor, son of Lewis Brothers owner Donald Tabor, had been watching the fire as it moved up Mill Street. It had progressed so quickly that the firefighters had been unable to evacuate the three-story Howard block before the fire began to cut off the exits. Johnson and Tabor made use of the hardware store's stock and dragged a ladder across the street before ascending the ladder themselves to help the Howard block's residents escape from the third-story windows and flee to safety. Other onlookers who'd been watching the inferno on Mill Street suddenly realized the threat to Hanover Street and the entire commercial district. This included Valley News managing editor Jim Wexler, who had been awaiting a haircut alongside firefighter Romeo Russell in the barber shop when the smoke first appeared. Spectators rushed to lay hose and assist the firefighters from communities all over New Hampshire and Vermont. The heavy fire hoses required multiple people to operate, and as the fire spread, volunteers stepped in to assist the overtaxed firefighters. Others turned to businesses in the fire's path and formed human conveyor belts to evacuate merchandise, apparel and goods from Tom's Toggery, and paint from Fletcher's and Sherwin and Williams. Amongst those evacuating paint cans was Albert Healy, who had quickly realized the unintended and devastating consequences of his petty arson and joined the volunteers trying to help. Meanwhile, the fire engulfing the Howard block had grown large enough to jump across Mill Street, threatening the west side of the street, which had so far escaped damage. On the southwest corner of Mill Street and Hanover Street stood Lander's Restaurant and Sea Grill, a long-running Lebanon destination owned by Michael and Beth Halifax. So we can see Lander's here, just across the street from the Howard block, and that was what remained of Lander's. As the fire roared through the Howard block, sparks leapt across Mill Street and the restaurant went up in flames. So too did the Halifax apartments on the floors above the restaurant. Jimmy Halifax arrived just in time to see the restaurant catch fire. Fearing the worst, he searched for his parents and found them safely watching the devastation from the front lawn of Sacred Heart. All of Lander's occupants had been safely evacuated, but the Halifax, like nearly 100 others who lost their homes in the fire, lost most of their belongings that day. The strong wind soon carried the fire back south from Lander's down Mill Street. The initial fire had spread up only the east side of the street, but now the west side was consumed by the growing conflagration. The Jordan apartment block next to Lander's was quickly engulfed, including the Lebanon Launder Center. Firefighter Charles Brown, one of the first on the scene, was still fighting the flames on Mill Street as the fire jumped the road, and he quickly found himself trapped between Lander's and the Jordan block. Realizing that his other routes were cut off, Brown made his way in the only remaining direction, west to the Mascoma River. Removing his jacket, boots, and hat, Brown jumped into the river. It was thankfully low, with a slower current than it had had earlier in the season, and Brown was able to wade and swim across the river to safety on High Street. Once back on solid ground, Brown walked across Hanover Street Bridge and rejoined the fight. So here we have firefighters fighting the flames on Mill Street, and then the view across the river about where Brown would have crossed with Lander's, and we can see the flames further down the street as well. It was not long after Jim Wexler and Romeo Russell were forced to abandon their haircuts at the barber shop that the flames from the Howard block, fanned by the gusting wind, jumped across Hanover Street. The Lindsay block, home to Hirsch's Army and Navy store, was the first on the north side of Hanover Street to catch fire. And here it is in better times. You can then see the bridge across the river and into Huff Square. And then the view back from Huff Square, looking at the remains of the Howard block and the firefighters trying to extinguish the fire in the Lindsay block. Like its neighbors, the Lindsay block was constructed in the late 19th century, and the wooden building offered little resistance to the increasing inferno. Firefighters sprayed the roof of the Jetty block, which is this building on the left here, across the river, hoping to prevent the fire from spreading west into Huff Square across the river. The firefighters on Mill Street were equally concerned that the fire might jump the river. The 1887 fire had started on Water Street on the east side of the river, but had easily crossed the Mascoma and decimated Mechanic Street and High Street, as well as the rest of downtown Lebanon. Such a fire had been a catastrophe in 1887, but the entire western half of the village was liable to burn if it happened in 1964. Employees at the Cummings Tannery on High Street, which we can see left down here, and this complex here. In this view, we have Mascoma Street coming down back the hill from Holborn Park, with Mill Street, and somewhere in that is Hanover Street. The employees at Cummings Tannery, just across the river from Mill Street, gathered on the building's roof, first to spray water at the flames consuming Mill Street, and once that proved futile, to hose down the tannery rooftop to protect it from the flying embers. Firefighters quickly joined them, if the tannery caught fire, there was little hope of stopping its spread to the rest of High Street and beyond. Whether the firefighters and the employees' combined efforts would have been enough is unknown, but the winds obligingly shifted, blowing the fire away from the river and the tannery. The tannery survived the day. Back on Mill Street, firefighters were also able to hold the fire at the southern end of the Jordan Block and the laundry. The neighboring grist mill, you can just make out here, would also survive. The shifting winds were a godsend for the tannery and for the jetty block in Huff Square, but they were a nightmare for the buildings lying east on Hanover Street. Directly east of the Lindsay Block, now a towering blaze threatening everything nearby. You can see here. Next door stood the Suburban Gas store. This too was soon engulfed, and the propane tank stored within exploded, launching lids and hot embers hundreds of feet into the air. This new source of fuel rapidly fed the fire, which continued its spread up Hanover Street. Beside Suburban Gas stood Lewis Brothers Hardware. Bruce Johnson and Jack Tabor, having successfully rescued residents from the Howard Block across the street, had only just returned to the hardware store when they realized that the fire had followed them. Quote, "There wasn't anything you could save," Johnson reported. "It just came so fast, there wasn't enough time to think hardly." Johnson and his co-workers were wise to get out quickly. Among the tools and hardware were firearms and ammunition, which exploded as the fire tore through the building. East of the hardware store were the train tracks and the dry bridge over the rails. Bruce Johnson described the underpass as a blowtorch, ushering the flames up the rail line and onto the north side of Hanover Street. The heat melted the tracks and ignited the road bridge. 2 firefighters were on the bridge when it succumbed to the fire and collapsed. They thankfully suffered only minor injuries. East of the tracks stood Krinitz barber shop, which you can see here in better times. And it was followed by Tom's Toggery in this building here. Joe Wexler had left his suit jacket behind when he abandoned his haircut, and his jacket was destroyed along with the rest of the barber shop. Next door at Tom's Toggery, owner Tommy Keene had the help of volunteers and employees as he rushed to evacuate merchandise from his clothing and sportswear store. And they succeeded in rescuing $25,000 worth of goods. But Keene had acted too slowly to save most of his store. As the fire gained momentum on Mill Street, Keene related, quote, "We could see the smoke. We still didn't get too excited. We just felt it was going to be extinguished. We still had customers in the store." But then the wind shifted. As Keene described it, the fire was coming in the back door as we were going out the front. And more than $200,000 in merchandise was lost to the fire. More than $2 million in today's money. As perilous as the situation was on the north side of Hanover Street, the situation was increasingly dire on the opposite side. With the shifting winds, the fire on Mill Street had spread east and ignited the Geyer Block, home of the thrift shop, and located on the opposite end of the parking lot from the bank building. So we have a view of it here. The bank block is kind of behind us, and this little building right here. There was little hope of preventing the fire spread to the neighboring building, housing Fletcher's paint store, which is on Hanover Street, right next door. The fire had now consumed so many buildings across such an area that firefighters were in particular danger of being surrounded or overcome by the heat and smoke. As 5 o'clock approached, the temperature remained in the mid-80s and the wind continued to blow the heat and flames into the faces of the firefighters. Pete Descharmes, seen here, was hit in the head with a ladder and evacuated to Mary Hitchcock Memorial Hospital. Other firefighters were treated for burns, smoke inhalation, and heat exhaustion. Romeo Russell, whose haircut had been interrupted, was fighting the fire in an alleyway when he realized how hot it was. Too hot. "I stopped sweating," he would later report. He turned to the fire department captain, Harold Stone, and said, "I don't know what's wrong." Quote, just as I told him that, I dropped right there. Stone responded that Russell didn't look too well. And Russell responded that Stone didn't look too good either. And then Stone dropped as well. Both firefighters were taken to Alice Peck Day for treatment. Both were released about an hour later, and both went back to the fire. In the meantime, the fire had spread from the Geyer block into Fletcher's paint store next door. Ironically, Fletcher's occupied the former fire station, home to the Central Village's firefighting force until the new station was constructed in 1954. The building was also home to the Lebanon Oddfellows, whose previous hall on West Park Street had been destroyed by fire in 1931. When the fire reached the Fletcher building, constructed in the aftermath of the 1887 fire, the paint cans exploded. The Valley News' Larry McDonald caught the ensuing panic as spectators and volunteers ran from the sudden cacophony and billowing flames. This is perhaps the most famous photo to come out of the fire. And we can see the expanding flames coming out of the paint store. Next to Fletcher's stood Currier's Custom Shop and the dwindling stock of the Endicott Johnson shoe store, set to close just a week and a half later. So both these views are from the back, from that parking lot, former Geyer block, Fletcher's paint store, the custom shop. And then a few minutes later, after the custom shop was largely lost, it started moving next door. Firefighters attacked the conflagration from the front on Hanover Street, from the back in the parking lot, but the water was little matched for the old dry structures. Romeo Russell recalled that, quote, putting water on that fire was just like putting kerosene on it. The fire steadily marched east toward McNeil's drugstore. On the other side of Hanover Street, the flames had fully consumed Tom's Toggery and spread to the Lamplighter restaurant next door. Again, in happier times, Tom's Toggery, followed by the Lamplighter, and in Woolworth's. The Lamplighter had only been in business for 3 years, replacing the long-running Conti's restaurant on Hanover Street. As the fire had spread up Mill Street, the restaurant's manager had grabbed the cash register, and the Lamplighter's employees had evacuated the building. Waitress Esther Truman started to lock the door behind her before catching herself and simply abandoning the doomed building. Their prompt evacuation was smart. Liquid propane was stored in tanks behind the restaurant, and they exploded as the fire spread. East of the restaurant stood Woolworth's, newly renovated and expanded into the space that had previously been home to McNeil's drugstore. McNeil's had moved across Hanover Street in early 1963, abandoning its home of nearly 70 years for the larger space recently vacated by Hunt's department store. So you can see Hunt's here from an earlier photo, and then the back of McNeil's. What had seemed like a wonderful development in 1963 now appeared to be a catastrophic mistake as the fire poured through the neighboring custom shop and into McNeil's. Owner Gordon Sargent remembered the advice of his grandfather, Charles McNeil. If you ever have an emergency, all you do is take your prescription files, your narcotics, your money, and get your employees out. Sargent did just that. Firefighters on Hanover Street and in the parking lots behind pumped hundreds of gallons of water onto the roofs of McNeil's, of Western Auto next door, and of Woolworth's across the street, with volunteers assisting where they could. McNeil's was soon lost, but the firefighters continued the battle to hold the flames back from Western Auto and Woolworth's, and from the rest of Hanover Street beyond. If the fire progressed much further, Court Street and the Flynn Street neighborhood beyond, you can just see in the background of this photo, those are all houses nestled in behind North Park Street. You can just see City Hall here. Flynn Street was dozens of closely packed houses, all constructed of aging timber. And all of it was liable to go up, potentially carrying the fire to City Hall and beyond. The fire had already spread north of Hanover Street to Hooker's Eagle Garage on Taylor Street. And here's Hanover Street, and Hooker's was back here. Further up Taylor Street lay the NP Clough lumber yard. Just across the tracks from the Flynn Street neighborhood, firefighters and volunteers hosed down the roofs on Court Street to protect them from the flying embers, fearing the worst if the fire moved much closer. And then the fire, which had so rapidly and steadily progressed east on Hanover Street, reached the firewalls. These massive masonry constructions, erected at the western end of Woolworth's next to the Lamplighter, and at the eastern end of McNeil's next to Western Auto, were designed to halt a fire before it could spread to neighboring buildings. On their own, they could do little more than slow the fire's progression, but the thick fireproof walls gave the firefighters time and a chance to focus their efforts. Flames licked at the windows of the Western Auto building on the other side of the firewall. See, McNeil's here, the firewall, and Western Auto. And firefighters and volunteers continued frantically pouring water onto the roof of Woolworth's. Embers coming down from the top wouldn't care if there was a firewall, would ignite the building all the same. Finally, the fire halted its progress, and the emergency was declared under control at 8 o'clock that night. In 4 hours, the fire had destroyed 20 buildings and the vast majority of Lebanon's downtown. Business owners were eager to begin cleanup. McNeil's owner, Francis Sargent, enlisted the Trumbull Nelson Construction Company to construct a new building before the fire had even been extinguished. But cleanup of the site would have to wait. Pop-up fires would persist for 24 hours. Most of the firefighters were released from duty by 1 a.m. About 30 remained from Lebanon and neighboring towns to manage the smoldering remains. Romeo Russell was still on site 24 hours after the fire interrupted his haircut, despite his brief trip to Alice Peck Day for heat exhaustion. It was Saturday morning, in the midst of the pop-up fires and smoking rubble, that searchers set out on a somber mission. Henry LeBlanc, resident of the Hickory Block, was still missing, and everyone suspected the worst. Volunteers sifted through the rubble in search of the missing man. In time, human remains were uncovered in the ruins of the Hickory Block, though an identification couldn't immediately be made. Ultimately, LeBlanc's body would be identified by the watch that he wore on his wrist. His fellow Hickory Block resident, George LeMay, who had been rescued from the fire the previous day, died at Mary Hitchcock Saturday morning. Once the last embers had been extinguished, the cleanup began in earnest. 20 buildings had been destroyed, many of them reduced to little more than charred piles of rubble. Boston and Maine sent out work crews to repair the railroad tracks twisted and warped from the heat. Electrical and telephone lines brought down by the fire were cleaned up and repaired. And the 22 affected businesses considered their options. The police spent the weekend searching for the person responsible. It didn't take them long to track down Albert Healy, whose casual arson had unwittingly caused such devastation. Healy was apprehended Sunday afternoon and charged with arson and 2 counts of murder. The charges carried a potential death sentence. Healy ultimately pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was imprisoned until 1973. The fire and its consequences reportedly haunted him for years, and Healy never spoke publicly about his part in it. Back on Hanover Street, McNeil's employees spent the weekend cleaning up not their own shop, which was little more than soggy, burnt debris, but the former home of the Lebanon drugstore across the street, which would host McNeil until its new building was constructed in 1965. Many other businesses, including Brown's Bike Shop, Tom's Toggery, Fletcher's Paint Shop, and Lewis Brothers Hardware, found temporary new lodging around town. Others, including the Lamplighter, never reopened. On a larger scale, governments both in Lebanon and at the federal level began making plans. Lebanon was declared a federal disaster area. The city council held emergency meetings to initiate plans not only to clean up and rebuild, but for a modern new commercial district. As soon as Monday, less than 48 hours after the last hotspots were extinguished, talks were already underway to realign Hanover Street, to replace Mill Street with parking lots, and according to City Manager Roland DeBay, to make the commercial district something of beauty and something to be proud of. Lawyer George Papademos had been on the front steps of City Hall with the city manager when the fire began Friday afternoon. Upon seeing the smoke, Dubé reportedly turned to Papademos and said, "George, here comes urban renewal." It would take the rest of the decade, but his prediction was accurate. Though Lebanon had been debating urban renewal for years, and many in Lebanon's leadership were in favor of an urban renewal project, many Lebanon residents felt different. In the aftermath of the fire, urban renewal would bring in federal funding to help repair and restore the devastated downtown. Plan B1 emerged as the leading design, with a proposal to convert Hanover Street into a pedestrian mall, reroute Route 120 from Colburn Park to Huff Square, and add extensive parking, some of it at the expense of Mill Street. We have the before, we have the after, which we are all familiar with, and then we have the plan, which shows us the original configuration with Hanover Street going up to Huff Square, Mill Street coming down, Tuscaloosa Street, and then the new plan, swooping 120 around and eliminating Mill Street, eliminating this part of Hanover Street, and converting this to a pedestrian mall. Though 59% of Lebanon's residents were opposed to the scheme, the City Council approved the plan in late 1965. The following year's council was decidedly opposed to the plan, however, and voted to cancel the project, until the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development made it clear that their federal funding to rebuild downtown, amounting to $1.7 million, or $16.5 million in modern dollars, the funding would be surrendered if Lebanon abandoned Plan B1, shifting the entire bill to Lebanon's taxpayers. 2 city councilors changed their votes, and the urban renewal plan was approved in April 1966. Construction began in November 1968, closing Hanover Street to traffic, removing buildings along Benton Hill and Huff Square, rerouting 120, and demolishing and burying the remaining portion of Mill Street. We just have the remnants of Mill Street here and the beginnings of the elevation that would swing 120 up and around. The new pedestrian mall was dedicated in August 1970, the final piece in the restoration of Lebanon's downtown after it was nearly burned to the ground 6 years earlier. Lewis Brothers Hardware constructed their new building in 1965. So too did McNeil's Pharmacy and Tom's Toggery, all warmly welcomed back to Hanover Street, even as Hanover Street itself transitioned from Lebanon's Main Street into a pedestrian mall, meant to usher in a new era of urban commercialism. They were joined by other businesses, the French Shop, the Tutorium, the Colonial Bookshop, and stood alongside the businesses that had survived both the fire and urban renewal: Woolworths, Hildreth's, Couriers, and Western Auto. Today, all of these businesses have passed into history, succeeded on the mall by popular restaurants, specialty shops, and a college where the stalwart Woolworths once stood. Would downtown Lebanon be what it is today without the fire? Perhaps. Urban renewal was in the air in the 60s, and in a struggling city with aging buildings and a new interstate highway in the works, change may have been around the corner whichever way the wind blew. But for those who were there, and those who know and appreciate Lebanon's history, the city's modern era can be divided into 2 categories: before the fire and after the fire.
you're here, you're interested in Lebanon and its history, and I hope you're interested in preserving that history. So today's event was hosted by the Lebanon Historical Society. I encourage you all to join. We have a Facebook group where we post photos and videos. Membership is very affordable. We have publications that we would love to sell to you. We meet once a month, very minimal involvement, and you get to support more events and talks, and we'll be hosting more later this year. So it'll also put you on our mailing list, which is great. Also, if you're more on a perhaps city government angle, I'm putting on my Heritage Commission hat. The City Board, the Heritage Commission, is directly involved in preserving and promoting Lebanon's history. We are currently a very small group of 4, so if you live in Lebanon, if you are interested in history and preserving Lebanon's history, perhaps through regulations or through education, I encourage you to come join us. It is 1 meeting a month, it is very minor, and we're kind of a fun group, so I encourage you to check it out and potentially come join us. Thank you all so much for coming.